So, Margaret Archer here probably needs no introduction, but I'll introduce you anyway. She's just telling me that her 5-year ESRC research project on the mediation of structure by agency by the internal conversation is on course. One book is in press and another is about to be written. And so what we're about to hear around reflexivity is very much coming out of that work, I trust.
I guess, yeah.
And of course out of your former very important work, both in relation to critical realism and sociology of education. So thanks, Margaret.
Thank you. So have we got till 25 past or half past?
You do. You've got till 1:30.
Okay, you stop me when you
I will.
please.
I'll indicate.
Thanks. Okay, so this is called Reflexivity, Education and the Decline of Routine Action. One of the interesting things, it's always more difficult to spot absences than presences, but one of the notable absences, I reckon, about the whole critical realist tradition, whether it's 3 or 4 turns, however one looks at them, is that it doesn't have a great deal to say about routine action or habitual action or routinized action. I'm using those terms completely interchangeably. And I think there are very good reasons for this, particularly in the first phase. I'm not sure I can, with my coat, produce much more volume.
We should have to come forward then.
Does the mic work?
No. Come forward. Let's be an intimate group. We must all hear.
Sorry, Rachel, it's the code getting in the way.
Sorry, Margaret. Much nicer that they come forward anyway.
Right. Now we have a congenial circle. I think there are fairly good reasons why critical realism hasn't addressed routine action in any serious way. The first one is that during the phase of the possibility of naturalism and realist theory of science, realism was much more concerned with the absenting of routine action. So Roy's main model is called, quite significantly, the transformatory model of social action. In other words, we're interested in what transforms social structures, social institutions, rather than routine action, which performs a reproductory function. Not that we've ever forgotten about that. We've always dealt with, Roy calls it reproduction, I call it morphostasis, but we've always seen these processes as being much more dependent upon power rather than upon routinized action being its own perpetuating device. And then, of course, in the second phase, dialectical critical realism, that too has exactly the same asymmetrical thrust. It's much more interested in the absenting of heteronymous determinations, the process of absenting representing the pulse of freedom. So insofar as realism is critical realism with an emancipatory objective, it makes perfect sense why we're more interested in those interactions that change things rather than those that reinforce the status quo. But I want to suggest today that there are growing tendencies within social theory that are becoming very popular, very powerful, and that therefore we have a vested interest in taking routine action and what deroutinizes it very seriously indeed. The kinds of tendencies I'm thinking about are particularly the revival of pragmatism, which has a great deal to say about the routinization of action, and the resilience of Goodyear, who is almost exclusively about reproduction and not about transformation. He's almost the mirror image of our kinds of vested interests. And of course, closer to home, there are well-known entrenched opponents like the long-running battle between Tony Lawson and Jeff Hodgson, with Jeff being someone who bases a lot of his theorizing on precisely routine action or habits, as he calls them. So those, I think, are good practical reasons why we should address routine action much more seriously than we have done before. And I think we have the internal devices for doing that, particularly insofar as we endorse reasons as being causes. And I'm going to argue that in an increasingly morphogenic world, the reasons that are found good by subjects, whether those subjects are individual persons or collectivities of different kinds, are going to be increasingly important as the mainspring of transformatory action. Now, secondly, why are we, I would argue, intransigently opposed to the take on the world offered by people like Ulrich Beck, Barmans, Giddens, Scott Lash et al.? Why are we opposed to them when they actually, in their latest, that is since the 90s, analysis of the decline of traditionalism, the rise of second wave modernity, whatever they want to call it, they too are talking about the demise of routine action in late modernity. What I don't think we can do is join them on their raft, accept their form of analysis of why we have something other than routine action developing. Why can't we accept them and join them? Well, for the good old reason that these theorists remain what I call central conflationists. They conflate the effects of structures with the very different causal powers of agents. But now they are conflating these in an empirical way into new concepts where the two are literally rammed cheek to jowl. And so Ulrich Beck talks about institutionalized individualism being the new structure of late modernity. And, quote, individualization is becoming the social structure of the second modern society itself. And then they proceed to write books with highly deceptive titles like Reflexive Modernity. It's a completely deceptive title because if you track the use of reflexivity throughout that book, it begins as an adjective qualifying modernity. So it implies that there is a kind of system regulation which is reflexive and which is a property of modernity rather than a property of lower strata such as people. And yet, when you trace through the pages in that book, it turns out that, and he admits this categorically, there is no such thing has systemic reflexivity. Systems do not reflect. It's a property of people. Systems have very different properties and powers, like centralization, which people can't possess. And that what he's talking about is not reflexivity at all. It's how late modernity, the risk society, whatever he wants to call it, has to confront, but not reflexively. If you confront something reflexively, you are reflecting upon the causes, the conditions, the consequences of your actions. No. Self-confrontation in modernity means that in the risk society, institutions various are forced by others to confront the consequences of what they have brought about. Nuclear threat of annihilation, ecological ruin, etc., etc. Absolutely nothing that's reflexive about this. And he has a long quote, which I won't read out, where he says, no, it's not about reflexivity, no, it's not about reflection, no, it's not about self-referentiality or any of the terms that exist in this sort of neck of the woods. So we can forget about that. It's just a sexy term that has managed to sell a lot of books. What they do have is a much more interesting argument, which isn't deceptive and isn't about the attributing factors like properties like reflexivity to things that can't have them, like systems. He's talking about a growth of reflexivity in second wave modernity. But I want to maintain that his whole theoretical model, and that of all the rest on the same raft, is incapable of dealing with reflexivity, and that's the main reason why we can't join them. If we define reflexivity, I'll just give you my working definition, nothing much stands or falls by it. It's just the mental capacity of all normal people to consider themselves in relation to their social contexts and their social contexts in relation to themselves. Now that isn't possible to a central conflationist. If you have made structure part of people and people's action at any rate impossible without them drawing upon structure, you have also, as Nikos Mouzelis argued very persuasively, prevented the capacity of human subject, deliberating upon context and doing things like critiquing and seeking to transform the context that was not of their making and their choosing. And it gets worse within this central conflationism. The next book was significant, Beck's next book was significantly called Individualization, which seemed to imply that individuals and their growing reflexivity would have increasingly important consequences for their proximate social contexts and their overall societal contexts. But no, there's a key irony running through that book. Individualization doesn't mean increased individuation. And it's very interesting in that book on individualization that in the reference, in the index, there are precisely 4 references to reflexivity. It's not a crucial process, and it's never examined within that book. Why not? Because although he has acres of print to spend on our capacities for making our own lives, rewriting our own narrative biographies, reinventing ourselves, etc. ad nauseam, these are all capricious acts. They involve no commitment, they have no structural conditions, and they have no structural consequences. So, although the subject biography is placed more and more in his or her hands, this capacity for capricious self-reinvention just gives us provisional man and pro-tem woman, and they can reinvent themselves tomorrow, so there's not much point in doing a lot of work on them, because they may be different by the end of the week. And he actually says that because of the uncertainties of second-wave modernity, people cannot act, quote, in a rational and responsible manner that is related to the possible consequences of their actions. So, in brief, forget the whole thing. And just proceed as if what people become by reinvention, what they do by permutation, has all the interests of a lottery. Well, that isn't our concept of the human being, and it's not our concept of social structures either. And reflexivity, I've been wanting to say in the book since Being Human 2000, is a mediatory process which is very crucial for how people fallibly, under their own descriptions, react to the situations in which they find themselves, which they have to confront involuntaristically, giving rise to different trajectories of how they make their way through the world and how they make a place for themselves in the world, which is a place where they hope they can exercise some governance in their own lives, though it's never complete, and become something of the person that they wish to become within the roles that are available to them in their social context. Well then, it might seem that we have more sympathy for Goodyear and his insistence upon the enduring structure of society, structuring of society. I don't think we do, because we can't go along with the conviction he entertained until he died, that that structure is relatively unchanging. And therefore that his argument about the socialized habitus, which produces routine actions in which people's dispositions are homologous with their positions, and positionality is therefore reproduced through dispositionality, it implies a unchanging field. And I think he will probably, once people like Scott Lash have stopped saying Goodyear is the only cultural game in town, I think Goodyear will probably become one of those theorists who is adjudged to have been very appropriate to his times, but those times limited to probably the 2 or 3 decades following the Second World War. But times have changed, circumstances have changed so much that certainly in the new millennium, habitus is not a concept that is going to be of enduring importance. Habitus, he always stressed, is not the same as habit, even though they have the same Latin root. But habitus, nevertheless, is presented as having a generative potential, a capacity, an adaptive capacity to enable us to play new games, but new games that are offshoots of old games. So how you will be able to play Kriegspiel once you knew how to play chess, how you could adapt to playing rugby once you've been able to play football. But the crucial thing here is that socialization is the mechanism and embodiment is how the habitus works through us. What I'm arguing, and I'm having to speed up, is that change is now too rapid for intergenerational socialization. That there are new games that globalization is bringing to the forefront that cannot be played without reflexive deliberation and collective discursive undertakings. For example, how can stock market trading or playing the international exchange market be done in an embodied manner? It has to be a calculative enterprise. How can software programming be embodied? Yes, typing could, programming can't. In other words, change is rapid. Children now have to know what their parents could not know. Children have to occupy positions that didn't even exist in the parental generation. So I'm going to have to cut this down to bullet points almost at this stage.
I think you should go on till 11:35. That gives you 9 minutes.
What does the demos say?
There's probably still
It
bullet
would still
point
be
land.
bullet points, but
You're the chair, Caroline.
you're the chair.
That's what I
The
think.
chair rules. Okay. So Beck and Goodyear, I'm arguing, have equal but opposite defects under these rapidly changed circumstances. Beck gives excessive freedom to subjective identity formation, make of yourself what you will, and Goodyear assigns an exaggerated continuity to socialization in a way that socialization can no longer operate. What I want to talk about in bullet points and to introduce education, sorry Tony, it's got sort of, sorry Tony too, that it's got sort of marginalised, is what I call the increasing morphogenetic nature of societies over time. I'm going to do the unforgivable, the grand historical sweep, which illicitly periodizes things which don't have fixed boundaries, and it's purely a presentational device. So please don't take it as a history. But the argument is very fundamentally that pre-modern societies were morphostatic, that they could indeed work through socialization for the most part. I would still want to maintain the very general proposition that reflexivity is a transcendentally necessary condition for the existence of any society at all. In other words, there isn't even a primitive society whose culture was so coherent and whose structure was so well put together, as it were, that in particular roles, agents never had to face unscripted circumstances, unpredictable occurrences, and this, I think, is wholly in the realist tradition. Traditional society is still an open system, contingency always intervenes, and it's always down to the actor to do just what the ethnomethodologist rightly said, work out, script their own situations, paper over the gaps, and make it look as though traditionalism was covering the event. And that's how traditions very slowly become growing things rather than set in concrete. The key thing being at that point that reflexivity, I think, was restricted to when you had to paper over the gaps and face unforeseen contingencies. But meanwhile, most of the time, people could live by routine action, and as it were to prove it, education could be a matter of imitation, initiation, and induction, but it didn't need to be formalized into what we know as educational institutions. Zipping ahead, the advent of modernity is when traditionalism begins to give way, precisely because either structure or culture, for circumstantial reasons, enter into a morphogenetic sequence. Now, when that happens, and obviously I can't go into the history of modernity, but I just want to pick out three features of it that were crucial for how routine action could still, for many people, either continue, if we're talking about agricultural peasantry, or be re-established in the towns, if we're talking about the first working class entrance into the wage form in factory production. And these three key things are that, to begin with, modernity only involves a minority of the population at its start. I mean, the French Revolution should never be called the French Revolution, it should be called the Parisian Revolution. And Marx gave us some excellent reasons, such as mud on the roads, which accounted for why it wasn't a national revolution and the regions couldn't join in. Secondly, it is a desperately slow process. We're talking about possibly 3 centuries, depending upon how it's defined. And over those 3 centuries, you have got progressive, what I call contextual discontinuity, being introduced into people's everyday situations through the struggles that are being waged between the third estate and the privileged estate, the court and the people, the upper samurai and the lower samurai, the nobility and the intelligentsia. It really doesn't matter which of these you take. The assertive side is promoting discontinuities. The interesting thing about this slowness is that this may be, and certainly was, the great age of education, of ideological debate, because ideology is one of the tools that the contending parties use amongst one another. It's simultaneously the great age of the struggles over the foundation of educational systems. It now becomes important for both the group defending their privileges and the group seeking to undermine their privileges to have control over what the people think. But we're still not talking about the majority of the people from the best of our statistical information. So the limited participation, the slowness, means that we almost reached the end of the 20th century in a situation in which routine action can still do a job, because that very slowness allowed things like the traditional working class community, which wasn't all that traditional, to develop itself and entrench itself, embed itself in mining communities, the new urban centres, so forth and so on. My final few words are about what I call the morphogenetic millennium. The new millennium in which I personally see as the first time ever of untrammeled morphogenesis between the cultural on the structural domains. It's going to be a time like we've never seen a time before, a time when the fundamental effect of morphogenesis, which is for variety to stimulate yet new variety, is already visible. It doesn't mean that the leviathans of the new millennium, the multinational companies, have disappeared. So haven't, but they are some of the main promoters of morphogenesis and of lifelong education, an education which is no longer coterminous with the state education confined within national boundaries. And so a new emblematic MBA gathered by people from elites from all over the world and beginning to constitute a new credentialed elite which has an even greater distance from the populace of any part of the globe on any point of the compass than ever before. Yes, so to wind up, if variety stimulates more variety, its tendential effect is that we have to have more and more reflexive people, probably reaching to the point where everybody has to become reflexive in their everyday life, because what they confront is more and more contextual discontinuity. And we know this already in terms of things like there is no job for life, or if there is a job for life, it's nominalistically called something like secretary. The skills that change over that lifetime are like holding 5 or 7 different jobs. So what I'm in conclusion is that in this new context of changing posts, changing job descriptions, intercontinental changes of address, the global transference of skills, then the scope for routine action reduces to things like being careful when we cross the road and regularly brushing our teeth. But apart from that, socialization is fragmenting and is of decreasing relevance for anybody's everyday life. In an ironic sense, Beck is right that we have to make lives of our own. Where Beck is wrong is in abolishing structure, because in millennial morphogenesis we will still not make those lives of our own reflexively under times and circumstances of our own choosing. And therefore, very last word, the new challenge to critical realism is a reconceptualization of structure under conditions of intensive morphogenesis, an acceptance on our part that when we once said structures are relatively enduring, something Roy and I have always agreed upon, what we meant by relatively enduring is going to be a shorter and shortening time span, and therefore reflexivity is going to become more and more crucial, both to individual flourishing and thriving, because the name of that game never changes. It's to try to be the people we wish to be, exercising the commitments we have good reasons for within the context in which we find ourselves. But these contexts are going to become radically different, changing, and important for us to address as the new kinds of structures that probably very new kinds of agents are going to have to live with. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I think it makes sense to have 5 minutes now, direct questions and comments to Margaret in case there's points, and we will have a more general discussion later. David?
Just a very quick question, which was, you mentioned there were 3 points to your description of modernity and its whatever. So I managed to pick up 2. I was
Oh, sorry.
what the third one was. You mentioned there were initially few people involved,
Mm-hmm.
then the length of time it takes. What was the third?
Sorry, the third one I didn't go into was how when any interest group mobilised, it was an entirely voluntary question of whether you joined it or not. Now I think you're dragged into the fray almost regardless.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm very interested in what you said about where things are moving, and to me, perhaps not coming from quite such a technical background, but certainly looking at the emerging personalisation agenda in education seems to tie in very much with what you said. The only thing that I felt that you said that struck me as slightly controversial, you said the systems couldn't be reflective, and I'm just worried that there might be a risk of being sort of anthropocentric in our view of reflexivity. And certainly from the way I think of reflexivity, I sort of see strategies of coordination and forecasting in terms of coordinating action. And that seems to me to be possibly, or potentially, a systemic thing as well as a human thing. Indeed, if you look at humans as systems, then that's a description of what we do.
But that was, it's still not the system in some sense which is suprahuman, which is doing these cybernetic kind of error detection, goal searching kinds of enterprises. So the analysis of that, I think, would be of people who are in the key roles, like Dave's officers, who have acquired the capacity. That's a history of struggle and privilege in a context in itself, to set the goals for education or whatever else the organisation might be. But you can't just kind of give the system. You see, I think that's where
Are you
it
not
will...
then reducing the function of the system, whether it's a high-level sort of human system, to individual agency?
No, the system, any organisation has emergent properties and powers, therefore it's irreducible. It's just that to me reflexivity ain't one of them.
Right.
And that it would be anthropocentric and anthropomorphic to work the other way around and attribute what is to me a quintessential human property and power, reflexivity, to something like a system which can have many properties and powers which have causal efficacy, but not reflexivity.
Catherine, and then we'll...
Thank you. Thank you. I was really struck by your claim that socialization is an increasing irrelevance, and I wasn't clear whether you thought that was a good thing or a bad thing, or whether you're neutral on it. If it is true, then it's humanly unprecedented, because there's a lot of literature that humans only become capable of transforming by first internalizing through imitation, and that one of our distinctive characteristics as species is that we love to imitate, and that we learn by imitation, and then at some point we become capable of transformative action. Now, if it is true then, socialization, which in a sense is that whole process of learning through imitation, if it is true that that's becoming increasingly relevant, that's quite extraordinary. And then I would find it quite disturbing, and I do find it disturbing if it is true. I would then suggest that Goodyear, rather than being relegated to the dustbin of history, could be used as a point of critique of what could be seen as a completely deviant form of human culture. And I've indeed argued that myself. So do you see this, if it is the case that socialization is increasingly relevant, what is your point of view on that? Do you have a critique of it, or do you think we just need to reconceptualize so as to encompass that new reality?
there's a lot there, Catherine. I can't answer all of it without hogging the rest of the day. It's more that we've got to reconceptualize. We can't think of it as a parent-child thing, to put it crudely. Parent-child things, I think, always will be important, but they'll probably be important up to the age of about 3. And even within that, the tasks of socialization will be rather like, well, I think the equivalent would be in education when we stop talking about conveying a fixed corpus of skills, which could indeed be acquired by imitation, and started talking about educating people in a way that they could acquire transferable skills. And the trouble with old-style socialization was that it was not readily transferable. Now the premiums will go to those parents who can teach their kids to be multilingual from birth. This will be a huge bonus, but it means a huge transformation of what we mean by socialization. The bonus will go to those who give them international experience, and that means disembedding them from the community. So socialization will no longer have a communitarian kind of a community-based, sorry for that slip, I didn't mean it, kind of basis, because community too is doomed. I don't see why we should be frightened about this. This is what our students are doing from the day they enter the university. They're making good the local deficiencies in their socialization patterns by learning the things that they want to learn in order to be able to come to occupy the roles that they see for themselves in the social structure. And it's quite interesting how it's also a prolongation, but it's under the control of the agent himself, herself, rather than under the parental gaze control. But there's a lot more to your question than that.
There has to be one for lunch. Well, I'm not sure that you can, because this will have to be for later or for lunch. Quick one from you, Bill, and that's be the last one. And we'll ask you.
Yes, what you say is enormously interesting. I think certainly your location of Goodyear in those few decades makes a lot of sense. And certainly what we presently see is the rapid decline of forms of social structure like political parties or trade unions and so on. I was wondering how you approach another feature of what's happening now, which is increasing collective self-identification along the lines of religion and ethnicity, which does seem to be more and more a prominent part of what's taking place in the world.
Yeah, agreed. Well, again, you've opened up a huge and crucially important area. The answer in brief would be I couldn't agree with you more about the demise, and probably terminal demise, of those hard-won agencies for systemic participation, the political party, the trade union, and other grassroots forms of organisation, which I think means that the social movement is going to become increasingly important. I think we can see the genesis of this already. The trouble is we're also seeing nothing but the ephemerality of it for the time being. So, the huge peace march to stop the war, global in kind, internet orchestrated, people out on the streets, precisely because it's internet orchestrated, very little follow through, and fall apart. But at least it didn't take the 30 years that it took CND to get itself organised, or END took another 20 years to get organised in Europe. So things like, this is where I would put the spotlight, this is the next stage of this research, is to talk about the development of collective reflexivity, which would be people are drawn to a party, they engage in internal conversations, they then externalize them, and after all, going back to Vygotsky, this is mainly what is going on in internal conversation. It's decoding what's coming into you and encoding what you're sending out to other people. So people will be attracted to the movement because of something that they've worked out themselves or with their group. They engage in external conversation within the social movement. They go back into individual reflexivity about, is the movement really going the right way? And the usual struggles are then externalized about strategy and so on. But that's where I see the kind of collective forces for change developing in the new millennium, rather than trying to breathe life into New Labour.
Right. Before you get on to New Labour,
I'll get
we
off
have
New
to
Labour.
get off.
Stop.
Yes, before you get beyond New Labour, we have to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.